Hello, everybody. This is Christine Djerf, and in this podcast, we have Google reviewing my two books, Void Logic and The Judge's Dilemma. I hope you enjoy.
Imagine you look at this company, right? And they have this one just ironclad written rule. It's in the handbook. It was covered in your orientation. The rule is company cars are never, under any circumstances, to be used for private errands.
Right. Completely non-negotiable.
Exactly. Non-negotiable. But every single day you're sitting there and you watch these three specific employees take those exact company cars to, pick up their kids from school or grab groceries or run to the dry cleaner.
You're right, out in the open.
Right. Management clearly sees it. Everyone in the office sees it. But no one ever explains why those three get a pass. So you're sitting at your desk, you're following the rules, and you are just absolutely boiling with frustration.
Oh, yeah. It's infuriating.
But what if I told you that your anger in that exact moment isn't actually about the car at all?
Well, because it's not. It's about something entirely invisible. It's about this fracture in the reality of the system that you're participating in. And honestly, until you learn how to identify that specific kind of fracture, you're going to continually misdiagnose almost every conflict, every corporate failure, and frankly, every societal breakdown you ever encounter.
Welcome to the deep dive. We are speaking directly to you, the learner. Today is Monday, March 23, 2026, and we're starting with that exact highly relatable feeling of office frustration because it's really the gateway to something much, much bigger.
It really is.
Today's mission is to give you a shortcut to being well-informed, but we're doing it by handing you essentially a pair of conceptual X-ray glasses. By the end of this conversation, you are going to have a completely new toolkit to spot hidden biases, locate systemic voids, and really identify the early warning signs of societal or organizational collapse, long before anyone else even notices a crack in the foundation.
Yeah, it's a profound shift in perspective. I mean, we spent our entire lives conditioned to look at what's right in front of us, right? The noise, the action, the presence of things.
The tangible stuff.
Exactly, the tangible stuff. We track the data that exists. But today, we're going deep into the architecture of absence. We're going to train you to look at what is actively missing.
Spot on. And to do this, we are drawing on a truly massive, multidisciplinary stack of sources today. We've curated a collection of CVs, rigorous academic research papers, and these deep philosophical texts authored by a really fascinating Swedish thinker named Christine Djerf.
She's incredible.
She really is. We're looking specifically at her decade-long autoethnographic study called The Project, alongside two of her major treatises. One is called The Judge's Dilemma, and the other is Void Logic.
Okay, let's unpack this, because before we can jump into the grand theories of how massive systems break down, we really need to understand the mind of someone who builds them from scratch, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Because when I look at her background, I gotta say, multidisciplinary almost feels like a massive understatement.
Oh, it definitely is. You can't really diagnose a collapsed building if you don't intimately understand the physics of how a building stands up in the first place. And Christine Djerf is, at her core, an architect of systems.
Right.
Looking at the curated CVs and the background materials we have, she describes herself as a multipreneur. But it's the specific combination of her skills that's so revealing here.
Yeah, it's wild.
It is. She's a process engineer, an author, a graphic designer, and a Web3 developer. She studied rigorous mathematics at KTH Royal Institute of Technology, wind power dynamics at Uppsala University, and she even holds a certificate from a 12-week Harvard course specifically focused on law and morality.
Wait, I have to jump in here for a second because, wind power, Web3 development, music rights, and a Harvard morality course, that sounds less like a cohesive career trajectory and more like someone just throwing darts at a university course catalog. What is the actual common thread here?
I know, it sounds chaotic on paper, but the common thread is structure. Whether you're mapping the aerodynamic efficiency of a wind turbine, or you're coding a smart contract on a blockchain, or mapping the ethical boundaries of human law, you're dealing with systems.
Okay, that makes sense. Inputs and outputs.
Exactly. You're dealing with inputs, outputs, rules, and load-bearing pillars. She's also, by the way, registered with STIM, which is the Swedish Music Rights Organization, and she holds an IFPI label ID number 8864, if you want to get specific, under her music alias Skvaler.
Wow.
Yeah. Furthermore, she built her own Web3 NFT-based verification platform called Accredited Work, entirely on the Polygon blockchain. So she operates across art, engineering, technology, and philosophy simultaneously because she's just absolutely obsessed with how these different domains structure reality.
Which brings us to the project, right? This decade-long study from 2014 to 2024. And this is where her obsession with systems turns into a literal laboratory experiment.
Yeah, a massive one.
She undertook an independent, self-contained digital ecosystem experiment. She essentially built this interconnected network of platforms completely from scratch. Like, the sources detail a news site called Nihetsuko, an independent research division called Academia, a social forum called Kvitrot, and a platform for selling original art called Strawberry Shopping.
And she did all of this for 10 years, mind you, without external funding, without institutional supervisors, and without outside developers writing her code.
Wait, but why go to those extremes? I mean, why completely isolate yourself from the entire existing tech ecosystem? It's like building this perfect, highly functional ship in a bottle, only to realize you still have to figure out how to sail it on a mahogany desk. It just seems impossibly difficult.
It was difficult. But she neutralized all external variables on purpose. She used a method called reflective practice, which is a concept originally formulated by Donald Schoen. It's basically the practice of learning in and through action, essentially learning through iterative failure and constant real-time adjustment.
Like trial and error on steroids.
Exactly. Every time a piece of code broke, or a design failed to convert a user, or a piece of art just didn't load properly, she documented it as empirical data. She did this to test a very specific hypothesis regarding autopoiesis.
Autopoiesis. Okay, let's break that down for the learner.
Right, so autopoiesis is originally a biological concept. It describes a system, like a single cell, that is capable of producing the very components it needs to sustain itself and reproduce. It creates its own boundaries and its own internal logic.
It's completely self-reliant.
Yes. Djerf wanted to test if this biological concept could be translated to human economics. Her ultimate goal was to see if a single individual could achieve total self-provision solely through intellectual labor, creativity, and competence in a digital economy.
And doing it without relying on the existing, heavily biased corporate structures. So she's the cell. The internet is the petri dish. There's no venture capital, no algorithmic boosts paid for by some massive marketing department. Just her brain, and the raw code. So after 10 years of maintaining this digital biodome, what did she actually find out? Like, did it work?
Well, the ecosystem worked perfectly on a technical level. The websites functioned, the art was produced, the research was published. But her academic findings were pretty stark. She concluded that hard work, discipline, and immense creativity are strictly necessary, but they are entirely insufficient on their own.
Insufficient.
Yeah. She proved that structural variables, things like access to pre-existing capital, established social networks, and algorithmic, reach those things vastly outweigh individual effort.
Wait, I want to push back on that for a second. Isn't the entire promise of the internet, and especially Web3 and these independent platforms, supposed to be that it's the ultimate meritocracy? Like, if you build a great platform and the art is genuinely good, shouldn't it naturally scale? Why wouldn't merit alone be enough?
What's fascinating here is how Djerf's practical experiment perfectly maps onto Pierre Bourdieu's sociological concept of cultural capital. Bourdieu argued that economic capital isn't the only currency out there. Your background, your institutional ties, and your social legitimacy dictate your success just as much, if not more.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, Djerf's art, her books, her code, they had immense intrinsic value. But she was operating in an asymmetrical market where visibility is literally bought and sold. If the algorithms that control the major search engines and social feeds require massive capital injection just to prioritize your content, then a perfectly built autopoietic system is just going to sit in the dark.
Right, nobody will ever find it.
Exactly. Merit cannot scale a system if the roads leading to that system have a toll that you refuse to pay.
Wow. Okay, so she built that perfect ship in a bottle, only to realize that the ocean outside is entirely rigged against independent sailors. But, you know, the real product of the project wasn't just a bunch of functional websites, was it?
No, not at all.
The websites were just the byproduct. The actual product was the knowledge she gained, because building this massive, isolated ecosystem over a decade taught her exactly how to see where systems fracture under the weight of those structural variables.
Precisely. By understanding every single line of code and every single mechanism of a 100% healthy, isolated system, she became uniquely attuned to what happens when a system meets an unequal reality. Which leads us directly to her master theory for diagnosing broken systems.
Void logic.
Void logic.
Let's get into void logic. The task defines this using 3 distinct layers: structure, signal, and silence. And the core idea here is that the void is not some abstract mystical concept, right? It's not a black hole or a philosophical emptiness. It's a highly specific, measurable deviation in reality.
Yes, it is the exact moment an expected element in a system goes missing. Void logic operates on the premise that a fully functioning, healthy system operates at 100%.
Yeah.
It has a rhythm to it. It has expected outputs, whether that's a server pinging back or an employee arriving at 9 a.m. sharp, or a legal system applying a rule equally across the board.
Right.
But when a system malfunctions, the total integrity of the system doesn't visually drop to 90%. It still looks like 100%. What actually happens is that a void substitutes for the missing element.
This is what the sources call the equation of disruption. I love how she mathematically frames this. A system is made up of all its essential elements, right? When one of those load-bearing elements is removed, it doesn't just leave an empty space that everyone can clearly point to and see. A void fills that space. The system pretends it's still whole, it still claims 100% of its structural space, but the actual function is fundamentally degraded.
To understand this practically, Djerf provides a brilliant field experiment called the silence shift.
Oh, this is a great example.
Imagine you live on a street that is notoriously busy. Cars honking, sirens, people talking loudly, delivery trucks rumbling by all day. The expectation, the 100% baseline for that street, is constant chaotic noise. But one day, at exactly noon on a Tuesday, you walk outside and it is completely, unnervingly silent.
The signal isn't the silence itself, though. The signal is the disruption of the expected pattern.
Yeah, exactly. Most people would step outside, notice the quiet, maybe feel a brief moment of relief, and just move on with their day. They absorb the silence emotionally. But someone trained in void logic registers the deviation structurally.
Right, they ask a different set of questions.
They don't just ask, why is it quiet? They ask, what specific missing element has this silence replaced? Has the road been blocked by police 2 miles away? Has a major factory nearby shut down without warning? The silence is not an absence of data. It is an injection point. The silence is the data.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If we compare this to other major analytical frameworks, it kind of flips everything upside down. Think about chaos theory, right? Chaos theory tells us why a system spirals out of control. It's the classic butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil, causing a hurricane in Texas. It tracks the cascading chain of events. But void logic tells us where the system spirals. It locates the exact missing piece that allowed the hurricane to breach the shore in the first place.
And if you compare it to Bayesian logic, the contrast is even sharper. Bayesian logic, which, by the way, is the foundation of most modern predictive modeling and AI, relies entirely on the accumulated presence of data. It updates probabilities based on what is known and what can be counted.
If X happens this many times, Y is likely to occur.
Right. But void logic activates precisely when data is missing. It turns gaps into meaning. It operates in environments where you absolutely do not have all the facts, but you can feel the structural dissonance in the pattern.
I want to try an analogy here to see if I'm really grasping this. It's like someone sneaking into your house and swapping out a massive load-bearing pillar in your living room with a highly realistic, high-definition hologram of a pillar.
Oh, that's good.
Right. Visually, if you just glance at the room, the house is still 100% there. It looks mathematically sound. But structurally, it is a void waiting to collapse the roof the second any real weight is applied.
That is a perfect analogy. And if you lean on that holographic pillar, you are going to fall right through it. The visual presence of the pillar is the system claiming it's still at 100%, masking the degradation underneath.
But how do we actually train ourselves to see a hologram instead of a pillar? Because in the real world, these things are heavily disguised. People don't want you to see the void. How do we spot it before the roof caves in on us?
You have to deeply understand what a 100% healthy system looks like first. You have to understand wholeness. Only when you know the true, uncorrupted rhythm of a system can you track what Djerf calls predictive maps.
Predictive maps.
Yes. You look for time windows. For example, let's say a corporation normally responds to a PR crisis in 2 hours. That's their historical rhythm. But suddenly, there's a scandal, and there is a 48-hour echo lag, a 48-hour silence.
Right, the missing response.
That delay is not just a slow PR department. That delay is a void. It tells you that the internal alignment of that company has fractured. Or consider pre-impact silence. This is the unnatural, coordinated stillness in a political administration right before a major scandal drops. The structure of their communication changes before the narrative actually does.
Okay, so finding a void in a computer system, a supply chain, or even a corporate PR strategy is basically straightforward math, relatively speaking. The code is there or isn't. The shipment arrived or it didn't. The press release went out or it didn't. But finding a void in human behavior, finding the void in how we interact with each other, that is infinitely more complicated.
Oh, absolutely.
Because when human beings encounter a void, when we encounter something we don't understand about another person, we don't just leave it empty, we actively try to fill it.
We abhor a vacuum. We fill it with our own emotions, our own biases, our own past traumas, and our own narratives.
And that psychological reflex brings us to the most dangerous, unstable territory of all. It brings us to the second major text from the sources, the judge's dilemma.
The judge's dilemma is the central paradox of human interaction. It states that no judgment, no matter how objective we desperately try to be, can ever be entirely clean of bias. Because the judge, whether they're a literal judge sitting in a courtroom in robes, or a middle manager in a corporate office, or just you, the learner, scrolling on your phone and forming an opinion about a stranger, is a human being.
Yeah.
And human beings view the world through the highly distorted lens of their own memory, their own fear, their own pain, and their own unacknowledged guilt.
The sources call this mechanism diagnostic projection, and I really want to break this down because it happens every single day to all of us. Diagnostic projection occurs when the label given to an individual is refracted through the assumptions and the emotional state of the person doing the judging. The judge looks at the void, which is the missing context of another person's life, the things they can't possibly know about their struggles or their true intent, and they fill that void entirely with their own psychological material. And in doing so, they completely obliterate the lived reality of the person being judged.
To illustrate the everyday friction of this, the text provides a brilliant scenario called the doorman's paradox. It perfectly captures the exhausting anxiety of distributed responsibility.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine you live in a secure apartment building. It's late at night, and a stranger buzzes your door from the street and asks to be let in. They say they forgot their keys or they're visiting a friend. What do? Society gives you no clear, absolute algorithm for this specific moment.
Exactly. I'm standing there in my pajamas, staring at the intercom, and my brain just starts spiraling. Because if I exclude them, if I say no, I risk being cruel. I risk leaving an innocent person out in the cold, or I risk a very uncomfortable confrontation through the speaker. But if I press the button and include them, I risk being horribly perilous. I might be letting a literal threat into the building, endangering myself and all my neighbors.
Because the system, the laws of society, provides no clear boundary for this micro-interaction, you, the individual, bear the entire burden of judgment. You have to fill the void. And that burden breeds immense anxiety. You end up projecting your own fear, or maybe your own desire to be seen as polite, onto the stranger.
Which connects right back to the scenario I opened the show with, right? The offshore company car paradox. Let's dive back into that. We have the strict rule, no private errands in company cars. But 3 employees openly break it and management does absolutely nothing. Why does that specific scenario breed such intense resentment among the rest of the staff?
The author writes a line here that I think every manager everywhere needs to memorize. She writes, "A system that writes its rules in stone, but carves its exceptions in air breeds not loyalty, but silent revolt."
Yes. Oh, I love that. So if I am one of the rank and file employees who actually has to follow the rules, my anger isn't actually about wanting the car. I mean, I might not even need to run errands that day. My anger is about the void.
Exactly. The real wound in that office isn't jealousy. It is the structural void of meaning. What the visible, unexplained exception communicates to everyone else is that fairness is not the highest law of this system. Belonging is.
Wow.
Visible exceptions enforce a hidden hierarchy. They humiliate outsiders by showing them in plain sight that they do not know the real rules of the game. The written rules are a hologram. The real rules are based on favoritism. And that is a terrifying system to work inside because you can never mathematically secure your own standing.
So the antidote isn't necessarily stripping the keys away from those 3 employees. I mean, maybe they have a legitimate reason. Maybe one is dealing with a severe medical issue or they negotiated it in their hiring contract. The antidote is radical transparency from leadership, explaining why the void exists so people don't fill it with paranoia.
Exactly.
But wait, this raises an important question for me. If we all suffer from diagnostic projection, if every manager, every parent, every judge, and every single internet commenter is constantly projecting their own psychological baggage to fill these voids, Aren't we all just walking around wearing VR headsets, playing completely different movies and just bumping into each other? Like, how do we ever actually agree on a shared reality or a fair verdict?
That is the ultimate friction of human interaction. And Djerf addresses this through what she calls the two-way dilemma. Because it's not just that the judge assumes and projects, it's also that the judge actively withholds. The void is being manufactured from both sides simultaneously.
Right, it's a two-way street.
She uses a devastatingly simple example called the chewing gum parable. Imagine a child is caught on a security camera, stealing a pack of chewing gum from a store. The visual evidence is undeniable. The store owner confronts the child. Yet, instead of admitting it, the child invents this elaborate, nonsensical lie about how the gum fell into their pocket or someone else put it there. Why? Why lie when the evidence is absolute?
Because to the child, the lie, no matter how ridiculous it is, feels like a shield. Any fabricated story is safer than the naked vulnerability of the truth.
Precisely. We constantly calculate which truth serves our survival best in any given moment. So in any judgment scenario, you have a judge projecting their bias to fill a void of understanding, and you have the accused actively creating a void of information to protect themselves from punishment. Both sides are operating in the dark.
So how do you fix it?
The only way to bridge this gap, take off those VR headsets you mentioned, is a mutual, highly courageous commitment to dialogue. The judge must completely suspend their assumptions, and the judge must risk the vulnerability of the truth.
But let's be honest about human nature here. That kind of vulnerable, open dialogue is incredibly rare. And when that dialogue doesn't happen, when the void isn't filled with conversation and transparency, it gets filled with something much darker, much faster, and much more destructive. It gets filled with fear.
Always.
And the sources take us through some absolutely chilling historical case studies of what happens to entire societies when fear fills the void.
It begins with a primal concept Djerf calls the spider and the scared. Imagine you walk into your kitchen and you see a spider on the floor. Most people will instinctively lift their shoe and just stomp on it. Now, analyze that action through void logic. You do not stomp on the spider because the spider is guilty of a crime.
Right.
You don't stomp on it because it has actively harmed you or because you've logically deduced it's a lethal threat. You stomp on it because your own sudden spike of fear makes the danger feel absolute. The void of not knowing what the spider might do is instantly filled with the need to eliminate it entirely.
The judgment is entirely about the human's need for safety, not the spider's actions. The sources relate this perfectly to the Sandel dilemma, which comes from a famous Harvard law course. Professor Michael Sandel asked his law students this hypothetical question. Would you shoot a suspected terrorist walking down the street without any concrete evidence of a crime just to be safe? And 98% of these brilliant, highly educated future lawyers, people dedicating their lives to the burden of proof, said they would shoot.
98%. It is a terrifying metric. It proves that human judgment, when placed under the pressure of intense fear and a void of information, always leans toward elimination, not understanding. Self-preservation overrides ethics every single time.
We see this exact dynamic play out on a massive societal scale in the Lindy Chamberlain affair in Australia back in 1980. This is one of the most famous miscarriages of justice in modern history. A mother goes camping in the outback with her family, and her baby is tragically taken by a dingo from their tent. But when Lindy Chamberlain faces the media and the courts, she doesn't act the way the public expects a grieving, hysterical mother to act. She appears stoic, she appears too calm.
The public encountered a massive structural void there. First, the behavior of wild dingoes was not widely understood by the urban public. The idea that a wild dog would enter a tent and take a baby just seemed physically impossible to them.
Right.
Second, Chamberlain's emotional demeanor did not fit the highly specific narrative society demands of female grief. So society faced a void of the unknown, and they filled it with overwhelming suspicion. They needed a familiar villain to make sense of the horror. An evil, murderous mother is a narrative humans understand. A random act of nature is terrifying.
So they cast the mother in the villain role?
Exactly. She was convicted of murder, heavily pregnant, and spent years in prison before entirely new, undeniable physical evidence exonerated her. The public acted as a collective judge, driven entirely by narrative bias and fear.
And if we go back even further in history to 1692, the Salem witch trials are presented in the texts as perhaps the ultimate foundational example of void logic operating in history. We always hear about Salem as this outbreak of religious hysteria, but Djerf frames it entirely differently.
She does. The Salem witch trials were driven by a profound, terrifying structural void, a complete lack of scientific and medical understanding. The villagers, particularly the young girls, were experiencing strange, horrific neurological symptoms. I mean, violent convulsions, vivid hallucinations, screaming fits, severe paranoia. Now, modern science strongly points to ergot poisoning as the root cause.
Let's deep dive into that for a second because the mechanics of it are fascinating. Ergot is a fungus, right?
Yes, ergot is a fungus that grows on rye grain, particularly in damp, cold weather, which perfectly matched the climate of Salem leading up to the trials. Rye was a staple of their diet. When consumed, ergot restricts blood flow and affects the central nervous system. It essentially causes symptoms strikingly similar to ingesting LSD.
So these people were physically poisoned, they were suffering from a severe biological crisis, but because it was 1692, they had a total void of medical knowledge. They couldn't run a toxicology screen. So they took this massive void of why are our children convulsing, and they filled it with the only conceptual framework they had available, the supernatural, witchcraft, demonic possession, scapegoating.
Exactly. The authorities, the judges, and the clergy needed to maintain power and order, and the community desperately needed an explanation for their terror. They replaced the missing scientific truth with a socially constructed truth. 19 innocent people were hanged, not because they were actually witches, and perhaps not even because the judges were inherently evil, but because the human mind and human society simply cannot tolerate the void of not knowing why they are suffering. They will invent a monster to kill just to feel a sense of control over the chaos.
It's so easy for us to sit here today in 2026, look back at Salem and think, wow, they were so primitive, we have science now, we would never do that. But are we really any different today? Have we actually evolved, or have our witches just changed their clothes? Look at the modern case of Anthony Ray Hinton detailed in the sources.
Hinton's case is a devastating modern tragedy of the void. In 1985, he was an innocent black man in Alabama charged with 2 capital murders. He had an ironclad alibi. He was at work, locked inside a secure warehouse at the exact time the crimes occurred. The ballistics evidence used against him was deeply, demonstrably flawed. Yet he was convicted by an all-white jury and spent 30 agonizing years on death row.
30 years.
The void of missing credible evidence was entirely filled by something else: racial prejudice, institutional inertia, and the public's desperate demanding need for quick closure in a high-profile case.
30 years stolen because a jury and a judge filled a void with their own diagnostic projection. And what the sources point out that is so crucial here is the collateral damage. It's not just the accused who suffers when the system fails like this. The rot spreads.
Djerf refers to this phenomenon as judgment contagion or social contagion. When a wrongful conviction occurs, when a system officially sanctions a lie to cover up a void, the trauma does not just sit isolated in a prison cell with the victim. It seeps invisibly outward. It infects the family, the neighborhood, the entire community. It creates a generational, deeply embedded erosion of trust in the institutions of justice.
Right, because if the system lies about him, who else is it lying about?
Exactly. The system's arrogant refusal to admit its own voids, its refusal to simply say, "we don't know," creates a ripple effect of fractured identity and paranoia across all of society.
It proves that human nature hasn't fundamentally changed since Salem. When a void of knowledge meets a flood of fear, human judgment stops being a delicate tool of justice and immediately becomes a blunt weapon of survival. But just to prove how far human nature will go when actual, literal biological survival is on the line, the sources take us into the ultimate structural stress tests. We move from the courtroom to the extreme edges of the earth.
We're looking at 2 historical extremes of survival, deprivation, and systemic collapse: the infamous Mignonette case of 1884 and Sir Ernest Shackleton's miraculous Antarctic expedition of 1914.
The Mignonette story is absolutely haunting. 4 men are stranded at sea in a tiny open lifeboat after their yacht sinks in a storm. They are thousands of miles from land, they have no fresh water, and their only food consists of 2 small tins of turnips.
2 tins for 4 men.
Yeah. After weeks adrift, baking in the sun, starving, drinking seawater, and going delirious, the captain, Thomas Dudley, and the mate, Edwin Stevens, make a horrific decision. They decide to invoke the grim, unspoken custom of the sea. They murder the youngest, sickest crew member, a 17-year-old orphan cabin boy named Richard Parker, and they eat him to survive.
They were rescued just 4 days later, deeply traumatized, and upon returning to England, they were charged with murder. Their defense in court was necessity. They argued that the total void of resources and the certainty of death justified crossing the ultimate moral boundary of civilization.
Right.
If we apply void logic to the mignonette, the void was both physical and authoritative. Society, law, and resources had vanished, leaving a vast empty space that primal animal fear filled instantly. The structure of their humanity collapsed inward, the hierarchy became predatory, and they sacrificed the weakest link.
But then you contrast that with Ernest Shackleton, 1914. The ship, the Endurance, is trapped and eventually crushed by the shifting Antarctic ice. 28 men are stranded on the frozen ice floes for months, plunging into the freezing, perpetual darkness of the Antarctic winter. They face starvation, frostbite, and profound psychological deprivation. And yet the outcome is entirely different. No one is sacrificed. No one is eaten. Shackleton eventually leads a small team on a desperate, near-impossible ocean crossing in a tiny lifeboat to get help, and against all odds, every single one of those 28 men survives.
It is the ultimate testament to the power of structure. In Shackleton's case, the void was physical and scientific. They had no radio, no hope of rescue, no food supply. But Shackleton absolutely refused to let a moral void open up. He filled the empty, terrifying space of isolation with rigid, unyielding structure.
How did he do that, practically speaking?
He maintained relentless daily routines, enforced absolute discipline, mandated social gatherings, and practiced deep, empathetic leadership. He maintained the moral boundary of civilization on a sheet of ice. If we connect this to the bigger picture, survival for Shackleton wasn't just about managing caloric intake. It was about preventing the invisible system of their microsociety from tilting into chaos. He understood that the moment the rules break down, the men will consume each other, literally or metaphorically.
And the sources mention these incredible, slightly terrifying scientific footnotes about other polar expeditions that did fail, where the crews did turn on each other and resort to cannibalism. It wasn't always just a simple lack of food that caused the collapse. Sometimes these microsocieties were wiped out by completely invisible voids. The text mentions botulism from poorly sealed, contaminated canned food silently poisoning the crew. Or, and this one completely blew my mind, the wolf poo bacteria hypothesis.
Yes, it is a staggering and somewhat bizarre detail of polar history. In some early expeditions, explorers would examine or accidentally inhale dust from thawing wolf droppings they found in the snow. This contained a rare bacteria that would bypass the body's natural nasal filters, travel directly to the brain, and cause lethal, sudden, and entirely inexplicable neurological infections.
So you have these highly trained, disciplined men suddenly going mad or dropping dead from an invisible threat they couldn't possibly understand, which then leads to paranoia, systemic collapse, and eventually cannibalism. But I have to ask you, pushing back on the leadership angle a bit, did Shackleton's men survive simply because they were on a giant sheet of ice where they could occasionally hunt a seal or a penguin and they had room to walk away from each other? Whereas the men on the mignonette were physically trapped knee to knee in a tiny wooden boat. Does leadership actually have the power to overwrite the law of the jungle in close quarters?
The physical environment certainly plays a major role in dictating the timeline of collapse. But Djerf's analysis strongly suggests that modern judgment, whether you're stranded on the ice, adrift on the sea, or sitting in a high-pressure corporate boardroom facing bankruptcy, depends entirely on what the leadership does when there is no clear answer. Do we collapse into self-justification, panic, and fear like the crew of the mignonette? Or do we create new, rigid structures, enforce solidarity, and demand discipline to bridge the void like Shackleton? True leadership is the deliberate act of holding the structure together precisely when the signal is lost.
That is a deeply powerful takeaway. Leadership isn't managing the good times, it's holding the frame together when the void opens up. But let's pivot to our current reality. Today, the vast majority of us aren't facing biological survival on the open ocean or the Antarctic ice. Our voids, our primal fears, and our most vicious judgments are entirely mediated by screens. Which brings us to the modern digital dilemma.
And void logic applies just as rigorously, if not more so, to algorithms, artificial intelligence, and our digital culture as it does to human history on the ice.
We see this most clearly with algorithmic bias. We increasingly use AI for massive, life-altering decisions. Credit scoring, hiring processes, sorting medical priorities, and even for parole and sentencing decisions in the criminal justice system. The algorithm is pitched to us as the ultimate objective judge because it is just looking at raw data patterns. But according to void logic, the void is whatever the data cannot see.
Exactly. A machine learning algorithm cannot see human context, it cannot see resilience, it cannot see a sudden change of heart, it cannot see historic redlining, and it cannot see the personal, agonizing struggle behind a missed payment. It treats past inequality as a perfectly mathematical prediction of future risk.
So the void of human context is permanently encoded into the machine.
Yes, and a person is denied a mortgage or denied a job or denied their freedom, not by a human judge they can reason with, but by an opaque spreadsheet that has inherited and accelerated all of our historical blind spots.
And then there is the speed of digital judgment on a human-to-human level, what we loosely call cancel culture, and the trial by internet. The digital crowd becomes the judge, the jury, and the executioner, and it operates at the speed of light. Evidence is deliberately incomplete, nuance is punished by the algorithm, context is totally invisible, and the punishment is swift, disproportionate, and often irreversible. There is absolutely no due process.
To illustrate the deep, incredibly sensitive complexities of modern judgment and how empathy itself can become a system-breaking void, the sources present a detailed case study called The Cost of Mercy. It details the highly complex story of a young man named Amir.
Now, before we get into the specifics of this case, I want to pause and speak directly to you, the learner. It's worth noting here that whenever we touch on topics involving refugee policy, immigration, or cancel culture, the temperature in the room instantly goes up. These are highly polarizing, deeply political issues in our current climate. We want to be absolutely transparently clear that we are taking no sides here. We are not endorsing any political viewpoint, left-wing or right-wing. Our goal today is strictly to report on the theoretical dynamics of judgment, empathy, and systemic voids, exactly as they are laid out in Christine Djerf's text, as an exercise in understanding structural mechanics.
Well said. So the case of Amir involves a young refugee who arrives in a new host country carrying a deeply traumatic past. He has survived horrors most people cannot comprehend. However, he is eventually charged with a violent crime in his new community. During the trial, the judge, the jury, and the public are understandably overwhelmed by empathy for his severe trauma.
It's a natural human reaction.
It is. The defense strategy leans heavily into this narrative of past suffering. Ultimately, the emotional weight of empathy overrules the circumstantial, structural evidence of the crime, and Amir is found not guilty and released back into the community without any mandated support structure.
But the text emphasizes that the story doesn't end with a heartwarming Hollywood-style acquittal.
No, it doesn't. Amir, who is still deeply traumatized and now lacks any proper rehabilitation, boundaries, or oversight, inevitably falls back into destructive criminal patterns. He exploits the community's compassion. The neighborhood, which initially supported him, becomes deeply fearful, fractured, and resentful. And the family of the original victim feels entirely erased and abandoned by the justice system.
So the system failed everyone.
Yes. The structural analysis here is profound. When justice becomes a currency traded for compassion, the hidden price is paid in stolen trust. Empathy is a vital human trait, but when empathy ignores the structural, mathematical reality of a crime, it becomes its own kind of void. It leaves the entire system unprotected and invites chaos.
It's the doorman's paradox scaled up to the level of a nation-state. If you include without boundaries, you risk the system. To combat these kinds of massive blind spots, Djerf outlines a fascinating, highly futuristic experiment she ran called the three-way dialogue. It involved herself, ChatGPT, and Grok, the AI developed by xAI. They were collectively analyzing a real-world high-stakes event, a major security breach at OpenAI that was quietly kept hidden from the public and investors for over a year.
The roles in this dialogue were critical to understanding how to find truth in a complex system. ChatGPT acted as the insider. Its programming instinctively defended the status quo, minimizing the year-long delay as standard responsible risk management and internal security protocol.
And Grok was the outsider.
Right. Grok, programmed with a different set of guardrails, aggressively pushed for critique, calling out the delay as a dangerous pattern of corporate suppression and a lack of transparency. Djerf acted as the structural mediator between the two machines.
What it proved is that if you only ask the insider, you get a PR defense. If you only ask the outsider, you get a hostile attack. To find the actual structural truth, you need divergent, conflicting voices constantly checking each other's blind spots. But this raises a huge existential question for me. We are currently rushing to code algorithms to be perfectly objective judges of our society. But if an algorithm fundamentally cannot see the void, if it only operates on the historical data we feed it, isn't it just a machine learning how to perfectly, efficiently execute our past prejudices?
That is the defining mechanical dilemma of our age. A technological system that cannot face its own void will simply keep making the exact same human mistakes, just faster, cheaper, and at a terrifying, unavoidable scale.
Whether it's a machine learning algorithm, a human courtroom, an office hierarchy, or an entire society, systems fail when they ignore the void. So the ultimate question is, how can we as individuals trying to navigate the world predict when these massive structures, our companies, our institutions, our economies are about to cave in?
For that predictive capability, Djerf gives us the spider collapse curve. It's a diagnostic model for exactly how systems decay when their outward growth vastly exceeds their internal structural alignment. It happens predictably across history and business in 5 distinct stages.
Stage 1 is the creative spark. This is the birth of the system. It's agile, it's highly purpose-driven. The leaders are in the trenches with the workers, the code is fresh, the goal is clear. Then we move to stage 2, the scaling phase. Demand grows exponentially, middle managers are hired to replace the original creators, and external pressures like venture capital investors or board members enter the chat.
Which inevitably leads to stage 3, center fracture. The system simply becomes too large, too heavy to stay aligned with its original pure purpose. Profit margins shrink, communication breaks down, and the original vision is buried under layers of bureaucracy and compliance. This fracture introduces the voids, which leads directly to stage 4, the spider phase.
This is the scary one. This is where things get toxic.
In the spider phase, the central node of the system, whether that's a corporate board of directors, a desperate CEO, or a central algorithm maximizing engagement, stops supporting the health of the system and begins to extract from it. The workers are squeezed for every drop of productivity. Truth and quality are completely replaced with synthetic performance metrics.
Right, hitting the numbers no matter what.
Exactly. The spider begins to feed on its own web just to survive the quarter. The system still looks like it's operating at 100%. Profits might even be artificially up due to massive layoffs, but that is the holographic pillar we talked about. The core integrity is a massive void.
And finally, stage 5, collapse or rebirth. The system either entirely implodes under the weight of its own voids, or it radically, painfully downscales to find alignment with reality again. This whole curve leads right into the final critical concept of tilted systems. A tilted system occurs when a void exists in a system for so long that the baseline of reality is fundamentally redefined for everyone inside it. The abnormal, the toxic, quietly becomes the new normal.
It's the boiling frog syndrome applied to architecture, a toxic work culture where extreme burnout is expected, a political system drowning in corruption, or a society living under constant algorithmic surveillance over time. People just accept it as the way things naturally are. The tilt becomes invisible.
To help you visualize and track this tilt in your own life, the text provides a diagnostic tool called the 4-leg collapse grid. Imagine any system you're a part of as a chair with 4 distinct legs. Leg 1 is structural integrity, the actual laws, the physical infrastructure, the financial runway. Leg 2 is internal coherence. Are the actors inside the system aligned and trusting, or is there rampant infighting, gossip, and corruption? Leg 3 is external support. Your alliances, your supply chains, the goodwill of outside resources. And leg 4 is the public narrative. Does the public PR story match the internal daily reality?
If you can find the void in just one of those legs, if the rosy public narrative entirely contradicts the bleeding finances, or if the internal team is deeply fractured despite a strong product, you found the invisible fault line, that chair is going to tip.
So what does this all mean for us? I want to challenge this before we wrap up. If a system is tilted, say a massive corporation, and everyone inside it just accepts the new normal, everyone is cashing their checks and playing the game, does it even matter that it's broken? Is ignorance actually bliss here? Why rock the boat?
Ignorance is never bliss when gravity's involved. Just because thousands of people collectively agreed to accept a tilted system does not mean the collapse window isn't rapidly approaching. It just means they will be entirely unprepared when the leg finally snaps. To survive this, to not go down with the ship, Djerf advises us to practice what she calls think without narratives.
Discarding the stories, stripping away the PR.
Yes. As humans, we naturally want to assign heroes and villains to every situation. We want to believe the charismatic CEO will save us. But narratives distort raw data. If you want to predict collapse and save yourself from the economic or social fallout, you have to stop reading the story and start tracking pure structure and signal. Measure actual function, not charisma. Track the timing of responses, not the morality of the press release. Look for the voids.
What an absolutely epic, mind-bending journey we have been on today. We started with Christine Djerf essentially locking herself in a digital room for a decade to build an ecosystem from the ground up. We learned how to mathematically read the silence with void logic, We navigated the treacherous, projection-filled waters of the judge's dilemma and the doorman's paradox. We survived the brutal extremes of the Antarctic ice with Shackleton, confronted the terrifying, context-free speed of the digital void, and finally, we mapped out the exact mechanics of how tilted systems collapse using the spider collapse curve.
And as we close this analysis, the single most actionable piece of advice from the text is the vital distinction between emotional mapping and emotional absorption. When you find yourself trapped in a chaotic, tilted system, toxic office, a panic market, or a screaming social media feed, do not absorb the anxiety, the fear, and the voids of the people around you.
Right, keep your distance.
If you absorb it, you become part of the disruption. You become another panicked variable. Instead, map it. Observe the chaos and locate its structural source. Say to yourself, this silence isn't mine. It is institutional. This panic belongs to poor management, not to me. Walk through the world as a calibration point, maintaining your own structural integrity when the systems around you begin to shake.
We are speaking directly to you, the learner. You are now officially armed with the Void Logic Toolkit. Tomorrow morning, when you sit in a tense staff meeting, or when you are scrolling through the outrage on social media or watching the evening news, I challenge you. Don't just look at what they are eagerly showing you. Put on the X-ray glasses. Look for what is missing. Look for the silence.
And I will leave you with a final lingering thought to mull over, built upon everything we've explored today. If void logic teaches us that the absolute absence of a signal is often the truest indicator of a system's health, what are the silences in your own life telling you right now? What is the one crucial thing you expect to hear every day, but haven't heard in a very long time?
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the structures around you, keep looking for the voids, and we will see you next time.